Welcome to the Gay Liberation Network on Chicago Access Network Television. I'm Andy Thayer, your host, and with me tonight is Daniel Williams of the Occupy Chicago movement. Occupy Wall Street has, of course, captured the national imagination, and tonight we're going to be talking about what do lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people, what stake do we have in the Occupy movement? And Daniel will hopefully be helping us out. He is himself gay, as well as part of Occupy Chicago. I count myself also part of Occupy Chicago, as well as sharing, shall we say, duties with a number of other organizations. But Daniel was with Occupy Chicago pretty much right from the get-go. Daniel, could you tell our viewers why you decided to get involved in Occupy Chicago? What motivated you?
It was sort of putting an end to the extreme inequality in our country, the relentless attacks on workers, the shrinking middle class, the feeling that for the first time that really all of these people involved in different activist movements could really coalesce around one issue, one call, and one effort to change our nation for the better.
And I think that's actually one of the remarkable things about Occupy Chicago is someone who I've been involved in, the Gay Liberation Network has been involved in anti-war activism for a number of years, and we've also supported union struggles going up to Wisconsin and so forth. But I was very impressed with how easily people in the Occupy Chicago movement very readily took up anti-war slogans. I mean, we have said it any number of times on this show here that the United States spends as much on its military as the rest of the world combined. Is it any wonder that we don't have the sort of social services that are actually, quite standard in much poorer countries than the United States? So I was very impressed at the great learning curve I mean, we weren't telling people stuff that they didn't already know when we talked about anti-war stuff. It made second nature sense to folks in Occupy Chicago. But in terms of your personal, as a gay man, what do you see is important for LGBTs to be paying attention to Occupy Chicago for?
Just the feeling, even sometimes on a daily basis, of, I mean, we are one of the most extremely marginalized people in our society, and just a feeling that you don't have to feel powerless anymore, that you actually have the ability to make the change that you want in the world, and just sort of feeling like there was a lot of injustice going on in terms of barriers that you face even on a day-to-day level with your job, where you think you can live, where you feel like you're safe. And it seems almost unbelievable that in the 21st century in the United States that you still deal with these things on a daily basis. Yeah.
Well, and there was a recent study that I read a few weeks ago, and I can't remember the precise source, that documented the, shall we say, pink ceiling for openly gay people in the workplace. While you may get the job, your advancement is fairly systematically blocked in most firms, even though they may have a paper commitment to diversity and so forth, that getting to the upper ranks is not something that is easily accessible for LGBT folks, particularly transgendered folks, I think.
Yeah, and even sometimes, even in some areas of the law, it's up to the judge to decide if you're in a relationship with someone of the same sex or whoever you're in the relationship with. And I found that incredible, dealing with specific aspects of the law, especially housing discrimination. That it really is sometimes up to a judge to decide, if you really are in a relationship with this person and what that really means. And you think that you had it all made, that everything was fine, that you have these freedoms as an American, and then you're sitting there in court realizing that it's up to someone in the robe to decide if that's really your life and if that's really your reality.
Yeah, well, and here in Illinois, we supposedly have got close to full legal equality with the exception of marriage. We have civil unions, but I think our community is going to find out, as the African American community and other communities before us have found out, that just because you have formal legal equality doesn't mean that de facto inequality is just as strong as ever. the segregation rate, for example, in America's schools in terms of African Americans and whites is actually statistically very, very similar to what it was back before the Brown versus Board of Education Topeka, Kansas decision. So I think, I know that after the passage of civil unions here in Illinois, I think there was a certain level of complacency amongst many LGBT people thinking, oh, well, we didn't quite get everything that we wanted, but we're pretty damn close here to Illinois. At least we don't live in Kentucky or whatever. And I think it's very gratifying that younger LGBT folks such as yourself recognize that, well, we may have, pretty close to full legal equality. There's a lot of ways where we don't really have equality. What has been your experience in the Occupy Chicago movement as an openly gay man? How have your other people, I have attended any number of general assemblies, but presumably nothing on the same scale that you have. What has been your experience in terms of people's openness to you and LGBT issues in Occupy Chicago?
Well, what was really wonderful to me, or at first it was strange, but then I realized how great it was that it was one of the first places that was not identified as being gay, or it wasn't, there wasn't, a rainbow flag necessarily on the door, but I never received any pushback really from anyone I talked to. In fact, it was the first time where I really thought I could be completely open with people, and they not only had not any issue with me, but they also really wanted to join in the same struggle, since we're realizing that no matter where we come in our different walks of life, if we're gay or straight or wherever we live or where we come from, that we can be united in this common goal. And
I think I've heard some very, shall we say, superficial analysis of comparing the Occupy movements to the Tea Party, where saying, oh, there's just one on the left and there's one on the right, and they're basically a bunch of malcontents on either side. And the thing that I find so outrageous about that, as one who has helped organize counter demonstrations against the Tea Party and actually seen Tea Party rallies up close and personal here in Illinois, is that they're very much about scapegoating immigrants. They sure as hell don't like LGBT folks. They're very very lily white in in attitudes as well as actual makeup for the most part. And yet in the Occupy movements, while they're not as diverse as we'd all like, there's not that kind of divisiveness, opposition to solidarity across racial lines, religious lines, and so forth. And I find that very refreshing. We do have a caller right here, so why don't we just take this caller and... Hello, caller. You're on CAN TV. What's your question or comment, please?
Yeah, I'd like to ask you and your guest from Occupy Chicago that given the widening income disparities, the fact that politicians from both parties are pandering to interests on Wall Street and big oil and so forth, and the fact that it looks likely that the super committee in Congress is about ready to recommend huge cuts in so-called entitlements, the safety net that older people like myself depend on, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. I mean, do you think that the system we have now can somehow be reformed, or do you think what's necessary is systemic change?
Daniel, do you want to field that?
I think what is necessary is systemic change. I don't think that you necessarily have to scrap all of these things completely that you might be relying on right now. But if we are to have a society that remains sustainable for the future, I know the caller mentioned, big oil. We really have to address, the energy problems. Like, everything will just continue to be more and more expensive for people across, all walks of life if we're not able to address this issue. And this is really the first time where we can all band together and say, no more. Like, we will not accept this. That we've seen austerity taken in other countries. We've seen other countries basically go down the drain based on people letting their government say that, yes, we can cut these services, and the people won't stop us. And this is our chance to say, no, we won't let them do that.
I would just say very briefly that I think if you look at the real structural impediments to any kind of far-reaching change in this country, the fact that money so dominates politics and the military-industrial complex is so embedded and so opposed to even the most minor reforms, that one thing we can learn from the Great Depression is that without a truly strong movement, not only in the streets but in America's workplaces, that's the only way that we're going to force the kind of fundamental change that I think many occupiers are in favor of. And I think for all the references to Tahrir Square and Egypt and so forth, I think one of the things that people in the United States, including unfortunately many people in the Occupy movement, don't realize is it wasn't just people coming into the streets in Egypt that overthrew the Mubarak dictatorship. It was actually right at the just before the United States and the Egyptian military decided to cut Mubarak loose. A massive strike wave began in Alexandria in the north of the country and spread rapidly throughout, and that's really what put the fear of God in the Obama administration and the military. Now, they're not out of the woods in Egypt, but I think that history in terms of, well, how can we actually force these bastards, frankly, who have so much power and think nothing about literally depriving people of the things that allow them to live, in many cases, in terms of food. I mean, half the world's population lives on less than $2 a day. People die because of these vast disparities. Before we go to another caller, though, I'd like to try a GLN first here on CAN TV with a little film of the arrests that occurred, the first wave of arrests that occurred against the Occupy Chicago. And over 300 have been arrested here. And Daniel, feel free to comment on this as this short film goes on here. This is, as you can see on your screen there, in Grant Park. This is the first phase of arrests. Daniel, do you want to explain to our viewers the issues in terms of why Occupy Chicago, unlike some other cities like Los Angeles and Albany, has not been able to secure a permanent encampment in Chicago?
I mean, particularly our city's history after the Haymarket bomb, like the city really took an effort to make sure that people couldn't gather in public spaces like this. So that's been a major issue we had in Chicago with our encampment, that there aren't really open spaces downtown that we can occupy. There aren't these quasi-public private parks that we could necessarily take over. I mean, we chose the city's lakefront. It is very symbolic. It's very important to not only us, but everyone that lives in Chicago. And it just seemed sort of egregious to us that the mayor really took a stand over, a 2-week, or there were 2 nights when we attempted to stay there all night with thousands of people. And the police came on horseback. They drove us back. There were people that, linked arms that would not move, and, they were unfortunately arrested.
Well, and I think it's important to note that this particular scene you see at Grant Park has particular symbolic. There's the police ordering us to leave. A little bit of humor coming up here.
And I think it's something interesting that, if you listen to the news or the mainstream media, that, they can't seem to understand this, but they never seem to acknowledge that this is supposedly the most politically apathetic generation that ever existed in our country, and you see them willing to get arrested en masse all across the United States.
Smart mouth there. Well, and this is right near the scene where the Democratic National Convention back in 1968, the Chicago police cracked heads with that chant actually ringing out through the streets right there at Chicago, at Michigan and Congress. Now, many people see, including apparently the upper echelons of the police, that its treatment of Occupy Chicago is a precursor to what they would like to do with the anti-G8 and NATO protests that are presumably going to happen when the G8 and NATO summits come to Chicago in May of next year. What are your thoughts about that?
I completely forgot to mention that it does definitely seem like the police are intent, or whoever is in the leadership roles, that to make sure that we are not there in the spring of 2012, even though it is our complete intent to be there when the G8 and NATO come to our city. While our schools fail, they close the libraries, they cut the transit workers' pensions, but somehow they have the money to pay for this convention of world leaders in our city.
Yeah, they are getting $55 million just for starters from the federal government, state and local government, for so-called security for the G8 and NATO summits. And the experience with other cities around the world has been that there are typically massive civil liberties violations, that municipal governments end up paying out millions of dollars in lawsuits for their civil rights violations. And so at a time when we need money for schools, when crossing guards are being laid off, when we face potential fare hike in the Chicago Transit Authority, when people need housing, when the people need foreclosure relief, to be spending $55 million, I just find obscene.
Right.
And I'm so glad that so many in Occupy Chicago have taken up the notion that we really have to organize against this obscene misappropriation of this country's resources.
And the media is really missing the story that we are reaching the neighborhoods. There are spontaneous neighborhood groups all over Chicago, the north side, the south side, the west side of the city. We're building really strong alliances with community organizations that have been active in Chicago for decades, that we hear their message. They're on our side. This is our chance to really stand up and say, this is our city. This is not the city for the elite. This is not the city for the global leaders that created this crisis and led us into it.
Well, yeah, and one of the things I think that is most notable about the Occupy movements is that, in contrast to the Tea Party, they are truly nonpartisan. There is not the Tea Party, I think, was basically here's a little. This is right at the end of the film, as you can see here. But the Occupy Chicago movement does not is not just simply a lapdog for the Democratic Party. As many efforts as the Democrats have made to actually take over, they've been unsuccessful in that, and I think that gives the movement a lot more credibility than the Tea Partiers got. Now, I do know that we have at least another caller here. Hello, caller. You're on CAN TV. What's your question or comment, please?
Hi, my name's Ronald Morgan.
Hi, Ronald.
I wanted to ask, I just watched that video. It kind of concerned me. You have poo-poo on your face.
Pardon?
You have poo-poo on...
Okay, there we go. That's apparently some idiot. We do get those calling in here to CAN TV. We have a broad audience, which includes not only people who want to talk about the issues, such as Daniel, but also morons. So, but I have the kill button here in my hand here, so we get the last word when jerks like that call in. Daniel, what do you think is the next step for Occupy Chicago and the Occupy movement in general? Because movements historically, if they don't move forward, they have a risk of falling back. I mean, there's been endless talk about, the bad weather's coming and so forth, but I think that's a rather superficial
Definitely
issue.
Superficial
but there's I think the political issues and the political development of the Occupy movements, how they achieve successes. I mean, that I think is a much more pertinent issue. How would you address that?
I mean, I would just say, it's almost every day, every week you hear some new statistics, some new story about the United States that really makes you realize that the Occupy movement is not going anywhere and is going to continue to go. This week, 49 million Americans are now living in poverty. Have you ever have you ever stopped to even think about what that really means? 49 million Americans are living in poverty. It means they worry about what they're going to eat every day, where they're going to live, how they're going to have money to pay for anything, how they're going to send their children to school. As long as we can keep talking to these people, as long as the major parties in the United States continue to completely ignore the needs of almost, a fifth of the country now living in official poverty. That's not including people who are almost hanging on the edge. That it's only going to grow. I know now we're reaching out, to people that are very active in the anti-eviction campaigns across the city, with trying to take homes away from people that, or not take homes away from people, but saving people's homes who are at risk of foreclosure. We're finally forging alliances with the transit workers, with the public unions, with the trade unions. This is not going anywhere. This is not going to stop.
Well, and so far as the latter is concerned, I think their Achilles heel has been historically their ties to the Democrats. I mean, they were, I think, a lot of the trade union activity in terms of the leadership in this city has recently been motivated by embarrassment over the double dipping in pensions, the six-figure pensions that come out of all of our pockets, and I think it's up to the rank and file to actually hold those union leaders accountable and demand that they break with the Democrats, because we've had any number of demonstrations by the unions here in this town, but they very carefully steer away from taking on the Democrats. They'll go after the banks, they'll go after this, and they go after that, but we're in a Democratic Party town. If you don't take on the politicians who are Democrats, then you're not taking on the political establishment. And that, to me, seems to be what really is needed by all movements. But, it's not like we're living in Southern California where, the Republicans are in the saddle. I think it's a very, very positive development that the Occupy movements are reaching out this way, because solidarity is really the only way that we can win. We don't have the money, we don't have the access to funds and so forth. And I think recently, just this past week, it appears as though the huge boondoggle bill for the financial services industry here in Illinois just got the kibosh, and I think you can put that right at the doorstep of the consciousness that's been raised by the Occupy movement. I mean, was it the CMA? I'm getting it wrong.
Mercantile Exchange.
Thank you. They were going for a big bailout, became a big Christmas tree bill, and Sears got on board, and everyone's getting on board. All these corporations that normally this kind of stuff just sails through Springfield,
definitely,
and it got the kibosh. And I think that is a great development. Now, I'm afraid we're going to have to close out tonight's show here, but first, before we do have some people we want to thank. And some announcements here. We are going to have our next meeting is 7 p.m. Wednesday, December 7th. It's always the first Wednesday of each month at the Burger Park Cultural Center, the corner of Sheridan Road and Granville Avenue. And the next GLN show on CAN TV is going to be Friday, December 9th, the same time, same station here on Channel 21. And then also we have some credits here, thanking all the people who helped us out tonight.